Hi, Misha, and Peanut is still here, and this is Bundesweek Part 2.
G36E.
Picking back up with Heckler & Koch and the G3 series. As I said in the video before this, originally they did not have full rights. In fact, they were just a partner working with the German government and Rheinmetall. In '67, Rheinmetall would stop manufacturing G3s for the Bundeswehr. Their plan was they would still manufacture the machine guns. And by 1977, HK would have complete, full ownership, production rights, everything. Although this process was ongoing for over a decade, transferring rights and tooling. So that's really how the roller lock guns just became synonymous with Heckler & Koch. And from the very beginning, 1960, they wanted to make a whole family. This was kind of the trend at the time. You see it with Colt, too, with the AR-15. And this is in kind of internal company nomenclature, the HK-31. The three basically being battle rifle, assault rifle, whatever, one being 7.62 NATO. The HK-32 was 7.62 by 39 rifle, entered into Finnish Army trials. And the HK-33 would be their first effort in a 223. And I say that legitimately because we're in the 55 grain era with the M193 stuff. And the first glimmers of the HK-33 would be 63, 64. And it was literally just a scaled down version. And of course, it's known in America because of the HK-93 and HK-43 imports, which I don't have one here with me at the cabin today, but we did a complete video on one a couple of years ago. They're fun guns, but the HK-33 really never was as successful as the G3 because, well, the G3 was adopted by the Bundeswehr. And since they had just adopted it, HK really didn't think they were going to be adopting the HK-33 and the 223 cartridge because it was far from being a NATO standard in the 1960s. It was meant more for export. This is why a lot of the kits we see are from Malaysia. There are also, production guns out of Turkey, so on and so forth. It was not a failure, but, just kind of a side gimmick, if you will. The standard HK-33 had a barrel about 15.3, 15.4 inches, and a fixed stock, that would be the HK-33A2. It was joined by the carbine version with a barrel right about 13 inches and a collapsing stock, the HK-33K-A3. And then eventually they would put the A3 stock on a standard length rifle, and that would be the HK-33A3. And then in the 1970s, HK would make a few product improvements, quality of life improvements, and this would become sometimes known as the HK-33E or HK-33V2. But the 70s were really kind of the end of the road for the 33 design. I mean, HK would keep making them officially through the 1980s and even 1990s, but they really stopped developing the gun. And there are two main reasons why. First, and more conventionally, what HK themselves, not the German government, called the HK G41. In 1978, NATO trials began to select a new cartridge. 1980, 1981, a Belgian version of 223, a 62 grain, the SS-109 and subsequent loadings, SS-110, was selected. To kind of meet the new NATO standards as they were, HK introduced the G41, and it was basically an HK-33 updated. The big deal was it had a 1 in 7 twist, at least it could. They still offered a version with a 1 in 12. It took standard AR-15 type magazines. It had a last round hold open. It borrowed some features from the M16, like the forward assist, the spring-loaded port door. Yeah, it was just kind of an HK-33 updated for the new standards, but it never took off at all. although they still had it in production for over a decade. And if this is sounding a little familiar, well, I don't have a G41, and very few people do, because, again, limited production. I have to wonder how much it inspired a gun that I have and a lot of you have. To my mind, the Setme L series, first revealed in 1986, takes a lot of the ideas, if not strictly speaking elements, from the G41, namely the STANAG compatibility and the kind of reshaped, simplified receiver that it comes along with. Again, they're different designs, I'm not saying otherwise, but the notion is there. And I should also mention that one of the few nations that bought some G41s from Heckler & Koch was Spain. Italy also purchased a few. In fact, eventually, production rights to the 41 would go to Franchi in Italy in 1995, 1996, in that time period. But it really just didn't go anywhere. For one thing, it was still a roller-delayed gun. In fact, it was the last roller-delayed design that HK really worked on. And for another, it managed to be heavier than the HK33, itself not known for being the lightest gun. Yeah, that's not going to fly. So a little kind of old-fashioned tech, a little too conservative, a little heavy, a little bulky. But it did, strictly speaking, give HK at least something in their catalog for the new 5.56 NATO cartridge. But the Bundeswehr in the 80s really wasn't interested. They were still rocking their G3A3 and G3A4. Why is this? Well, a lot of the rifles weren't all that old. And up until 1980, 7.62 NATO was a standard. And it was a pretty effective gun. Compared to the FAL and M14, it was a little shorter, about 40 inches. You could put a collapsing stock on, even if not comfortable, It did reduce it down to about 33 inches. It was reliable, dependable. The stamped receiver was cost-effective to maintain. Yeah, no last round hold open. And yeah, especially as newer versions came along with the wide forearm and the bipod, it was going from 9 to 10 pounds. Not the lightest in the world. The alloy mags helped, but still 7.62 NATO ammunition. Little on the heavy side. Select fire wasn't all that useful. I mean, that's just kind of a common thing. Maybe more so than on an M14. So by the 1980s, this was looking a little long, a little heavy, not controllable and automatic. But they hung on to it. And part of it was they were kind of waiting for HK's next newest and greatest thing, which appeared finally in 1988, and absolutely was not the G36. Hello, Miss Peanut. Peanut has joined the chat. The reason that Heckler & Koch kind of stopped developing the HK33 and the G41 was frankly half-hearted, with not a lot of put into it, was the G11. Again, it was an internal company name, much like the later G41, because it actually predates it. You should not be surprised that I do not have a G11. Heckler & Koch only made about 1,000, of course no Shimano's, so I thought, it's a nice evening, although it is cooling off again. We had a little bit of a cool wave come through, so let's sit outside on the porch for a minute and talk about this interesting gun, because it is extremely relevant to why the G3 stayed in longer than intended and why the G36 is the way it is. It goes all the way back to 1967. So the U.S. is in the middle of the Vietnam War, and it's using .223, the 55 grain, M193. And this is the earliest idea. Maybe we should have a second standard NATO rifle cartridge. You have 7.62 NATO. Things go ahead. And very early on, the West German government, their big deal is hit probability. The G3, especially in automatic, but even semi-auto, with that heavy hitting cartridge, the soldiers aren't getting the accuracy, the hit probability, the shots fired per target hit that they want. Long story short, they decide that a caseless cartridge would be the answer to their prayers. And this leads to a conglomerate company known as GSHG being formed. Haven't heard of it, doesn't matter. It was actually established just to develop this new rifle. And it was pioneered, it was led by Heckler & Koch, who would design the rifle hardware itself. The company Nobel would design the caseless ammunition, the propellant, all that good stuff. And to get that hit probability, it was decided very early on that a reflex sight would be needed. Regular irons just wouldn't match it. So Hensoldt, who'd already sent nearly 100,000 scopes to the Bundeswehr for the G3, yeah, they were a natural pick. So late 60s, early 70s work continues. And believe it or not, Heckler & Koch actually had some working proof of concept prototypes ready by 1974, although they hadn't even picked a cartridge yet. They played around with everything, although it was basically anywhere between 4.3 and 4.9 millimeter. Always going to be a pretty small caliber round. And caseless was the name of the game. Now, interestingly, while of course I've never even fired a G11 or handled one, I have actually fired a caseless cartridge. The old gunsmith of mine in my own hometown actually had a caseless 22. It was kind of interesting. It was good. 22 bullet with some material on the back, and then the powder was kind of glummed on there, glued there with a primer in the back. And the idea behind caseless, it's much lighter weight than, well, case. It can have a higher rate of fire. You would think it would need an ejection port, which when it works normally, you're correct, it doesn't. But think about it. What if you need to unload the chamber or you have a dud round? So you still actually do need an ejection port, although its usefulness is pretty minimal, but it's still there. It also can allow for lighter weight magazines and just an overall lighter weight action and system, and that's what they were going for, while still having good hit probability. What I find interesting about this is while they're worried about hit probability, you don't hear a lot about penetration. Oh well. So the West German government is actually hopeful that this can be shown off to NATO by 1977. And in 1974, HK is basically awarded the contract. It had some competitors, Mauser comes to mind, but they're kind of clearly stretching ahead of anyone else by this point. But a wrench is thrown in the works. Changes start being made. The caliber changes again. This sets Nobel back. Hensoldt discovers that going with a reflex sight just won't work, so they have to switch over to an actual optical scope around 1976. Of course, HK hits their own things. And this is also when the companies start using their own R&D budgets, their own funding. Now, they're getting plenty of Deutschmarks from the West German government, don't get me wrong, but they're going into debt themselves to develop this. You can see where this is going. Regardless, things go back and forth in the 70s. They develop it. They actually get pretty close. However, in 1980, October, NATO selects SS-109 62 grain as its secondary rifle cartridge. And you would think this would leave the G11 project dead in the water. And it would flounder for a few years, although HK primarily would continue development. But Hensoldt's still there too. For example, in 1982 or thereabouts, they would go to a polygonal rifle barrel. And I'm mentioning this for a reason later on as well. And they would finally select the cartridge that they would ultimately go with, 4.7 by 33 millimeter. And they would continue the design. In some ways, it's good they did, because in 1984, the Yanks got interested. And so the project was revitalized. The U.S. Department of Defense, the DoD, gets interested. They are thinking about replacing their M16. Not for the first, absolutely not for the last time. And there's an upcoming program, the Advanced Combat Rifle, ACR. And so they want to work with the HK to have the G11, actually a variant made for America, and the 4.7 caseless round is a NATO standard for the U.S. and others. And so a pre-production contract is actually signed, and I believe this is the G11K2 when it gets involved, but yeah, getting ahead of myself. So there are plans to deliver it to America. And this is at a time when the Cold War is again heating up a little bit. So West Germany's not 100% out. And so progress picks up again. For example, in 1986, Hensoldt finalized the design for the Z01 optic, and it was ready to go. And by March of 1987, the first production version, the G11K1, is ready to start shipping for troop trials or whatever needs. And by 1988, they've got production for the 4.73 by 33 millimeter caseless round ready to go. So these years, everything is finally coming together. And beginning in 87, the West German Bundeswehr starts trying this gun out. And trials would last for roughly a year and a half, ending in January of 1989. And guess what? It actually works pretty well. They say that there is a 100% improvement over the hit probability compared with the G3, which is always what they were interested in. The ammunition worked well, the scope and all that. It's looking good. On top of that, right as the Bundeswehr is kind of wrapping up, the first 5 or so guns are sent over to the U.S. for the ACR trials, and Germans start training Americans on how to use them. So you've got two big interested parties. And I want to point out, too, at this time, late 80s, the Bundeswehr is pretty much at its largest point in history, with one exception. When it was established in 1955, it was obviously very small. By 1960, it grew to roughly 240,000 men, and it would more than double that, growing to just under 500,000 men, a rate it would pretty much sustain throughout the 80s. So, not bad. In fact, purchase orders and all that. And by beginning in 1990, it looks like it's going to happen. Now, it's often been reported that the contract was signed for the G11. That doesn't seem to be exactly true, but a lot of promises were made. In April, basically, the finalized version was ready to go. The government was very interested. HK would show off the design to the military brass. They liked it. Troop trials had gone well. And the German government even confirmed that they had allocated resources in the 1989 and 1990 budgets to purchase the G11, the new cartridge, support materiel, and they were hoping to start issuing these to frontline troops by like 1992. And then they would continue to purchase them through about 2002, with an ultimate goal as many as 300,000 rifles. Okay, it's smaller than the G3, but, that's a large order. So things are looking up. HK's gearing up. They put tons of effort into this, over 2 decades of research, a lot of their own money, not to mention taxpayers' money, but hey, it's finally paying off. I'm not going to get into how complicated the design is and how that might have worked in the real world. Forgotten Weapons has a takedown video on that. I'm focusing more on the history. Who knows how it would have worked out in reality? In the end, it doesn't matter, because it never happened. Right as things were looking good for the G11, the tide was turning on the other side. Almost quite literally. 1990. Not a good year for the G11. First, in April, the Warsaw Pact crumbled. This would be the beginning of the major threat, the enemy of Germany and of NATO ending. Now, of course, the Soviet Union would take longer, not ending until 1991, but even with the crumbling of the Warsaw Pact, it helps. And of course, this would be the time when the Berlin Wall would metaphorically and then literally come down, opening of the Brandenburg Gate and all that. And this, of course, would lead to reunification, which had pros and cons. And interesting, it was a political hot potato. You'd think the West would just be all for it. Not really. Some did not want a reunified Germany. The Soviets were in an interesting position. It's a whole thing. But it wasn't good news for Heckler & Koch's prospects for the G11 and the Bundeswehr in general. On top of that, in September, HK discovered that all the way back in April, the American government, the DoD, the ACR program was pretty much just a waste of time. Got everyone's hopes up. They said, you know what? None of the rifles anyone submitted really, we're going to stick with the M16. Something we've heard time and time again. Sig Sauer, take note with the XM7. We'll see. But it happened to HK that year. So actually, not only did they not fulfill that pre-production contract they signed way back in '84, that was canceled. So they didn't get that funding that they were hoping for, even though the G11K1 and G11K2 were pretty much good to go. Nevertheless, the Bundeswehr, right? They're going to do it. Well, October of 1990, unification moves ahead, and they start to combine everything. And East Germany brought with it its arms industry and stockpiles of all kinds of AKs and AK resources. On top of that, this would be the high water mark of the military. For a brief time, 1991, it was around 600,000 men because of the influx. Although, because of the end of the Cold War, as it would be known, quickly budget cuts would happen. And this would actually be mandated. Back in November of 1990, a treaty was signed. This was to kind of allay Russian worries and things about conventional armed forces in Europe, the CFE treaty. And this would pretty much mandate that all the militaries would scale back, all their equipment would be scaled back, future purchases would be limited, and excess surplus small arms and other things would be destroyed. This was to try to prevent proliferation after the Cold War. Now, this treaty did not go immediately into effect, but it was signed and it would not be good for export. So, zip forward to the beginning of 1992, and basically the German government, now becoming unified, says, you know, we had allocated in the budget to buy the G11. Let's not do that. At least they kind of dangled a little carrot of let's not do it yet. And so for that year, basically the defense minister just took the G11 off the procurement. So they're not buying any, but they said, oh, you know, we still might do it. Yeah. So in March of that year, HK finalized production for the G11K2. It was ready to go. There you have it. Problem. Remember how I said way back beginning in the 70s, HK started spending its own money in addition to taxpayer money. That meant that over 84 million Deutschmarks had been spent on the G11 program. That sounds huge until you realize that HK themselves dipped into their own R&D budget more than twice that, 180 million Deutschmarks. Later that year, in July, the CFE treaty would go into effect, which wasn't necessarily good, even though they knew it was coming. And then just under a year later, 1993, it's made official. The G11 isn't going to be adopted. It's a non-NATO standard cartridge. It's not going to be a NATO standard cartridge. That's it. What about HK's big old debt? This old one. Well, back inside in the nice evening because we can finally start talking about this rifle. The reality, not the fantasy, not the dream of the G11. By 1992, several things had changed, but several things remained the same. Not only is the Warsaw Pact gone, not only do we have the new treaty limitation of arms going into effect, even the Soviet Union itself is now gone. We have Russia, but the fact of the matter is, while the Bundeswehr is scaling down, as I said, they were nearly 600,000 on paper after reunification, and by 2000 it would be not much more than 320,000, and even down to 200,000 years later. They still needed a new small arm. The G3, they didn't have enough to go around. They're aging. HK is taking this out of production. And they have their complaints by this point. Again, hit probability isn't what they want it to be. Ammo is heavy. Their weapon is heavy. While it was modular in advance for its day and time in the 60s, you know, it's days past. In fact, they're one of the few nations that did not adopt a 5.56 rifle in NATO before the end of the Cold War. Of course, they could have used the East German MPI AK-74, plenty of those to go around. East Germany had only started making those around 1986, but no, that was never going to happen. The West was leading the way. And at first, of course, HK said, there's the G11. And then they said, well, okay, if you don't have money to buy the G11, how about you just buy enough G11s for the frontline guys, the special forces guys, too. And then you buy the G41, the very conventional roller-locked gun, hello peanut, for, you know, reserve troops, training, stockpiles, all that. But no, the Germans said that it wasn't really practical to have the 4.7 cartridge. Yes, I know. And 5.56, logistically, this just doesn't make sense. So this was rejected in 92, 93, this thing. And this was about the only reason they kept the G41 design around. Once it was clear Germany was not going to go with it, this is when they start looking to sell it off and ultimately do. And it's at this time they quietly just kind of cancel the G11. They're not going anywhere. And instead, they start Project 50, sometimes also called the HK50 project. That's what we get here. Now, you might be wondering, what about that debt that HK has? Nearly 200 million Deutschmarks. Well, 1991, they were essentially bought out. They were acquired by Royal Ordnance, which itself had been acquired by British Aerospace around 1987. So they basically become owned by a subsidiary of the British. And this actually works out well for the Brits because this is how HK got directly involved in turning the not-so-awesome L85A1 into the pretty acceptable L85A2, along with some accessories. So it worked out well. So HK is basically British-owned at this point, but they're still, a German company in Obendorf doing the thing. And they come out with this project as a evolutionary step forward, not a revolutionary step forward, of a modular rifle. They were thinking we could have the same receiver chassis for 5.56, maybe some 7.62 39, 9mm, meet the post-Cold War needs. And at the same time, the new unified German government, the new unified Bundeswehr, puts out requirements for its next generation rifle. Of course, the Bundeswehr has a ton of requirements, but, you know, the half a dozen or so that seem important, that hit probability. There are pretty strict range and accuracy requirements. Basically, be more accurate on automatic or single shot than the G3. Essentially, they said without saying we want to go to 5.56 because, you know, 7.62 NATO is just not going to meet the hit probability of, the repeatability on automatic fire. Also, it needs to be cheaper than the G3. Okay? It needs to be modular, convertible. We can use the same weapon, put it in a different barrel for a different role. Carbine, rifle, machine gun. That actually gels well with what HK is already working on. It needs to be lighter weight, i.e. essentially polymer construction. And, kind of a sign of the times, it needs to be ambidextrous. I mean, something that most rifles are today, but they were a little bit ahead of the curve. Also, they had kind of played around with bullpups, like the Steyr AUG. They also saw the L85 fiasco, so they said a conventional layout. So, i.e. no bullpups. And based on the weight and accuracy and all that the government ordered, HK developed this. By 1995, the prototypes were ready to go. It went through some testing, although it was quite rapid, truth be told. By 1996, HK was ramping up production, and by 1997, the first order for 33,000 so-called Gewehr 36 G36s was placed, with an option to increase to 50,000, essentially 17,000 more, that was very soon exercised. The government would start practicing with that summer, and HK would continue to deliver orders. And this would actually first see combat, one of the first times Germany would exercise some force itself in Kosovo in 1999. And I'm sure most of you know the G36, but in case you don't, let's check out the specs.
It's very, very light. I mean, this is the lightest gun I've ever held that is this size.
They wanted something smaller and lighter than the G3, and they got it. With the stock deployed, with the standard 18.9-inch barrel, so actually technically a longer barrel than the G3, we're just about 39 inches, give or take which exact stock. So it's not much shorter with the stock out, but we do get a longer barrel. But you fold the stock in, and we go to just under 30 inches. So that's cool. Weight-wise, because of the requirements and everything else, the Bundeswehr version is about 8 pounds with its equipment. Lighter than the G3 by about 1.5 pounds. And if you don't need the optic, that drops to a little over 7.25 pounds. So it is a very light gun. The barrel is interesting. 1-in-7 twist. Remember how I said HK went to polygonal rifling? Well, they carried it on here, chrome lined. And the nearly 19-inch barrel is to try to give it that accuracy the Bundeswehr wanted. But it is a lightweight profile to also meet the other requirements. And this handguard is free floating. And another aspect to the accuracy has to do with our standard optic here. One reason I was sure to mention Hensel when we're talking about the G11 was because they also made this, the ZF 3x4, at least on the bottom, with a reflex red dot on top. Again, it's a modular component to try to meet the accuracy, hit probability standards, and for the mid to late 90s is pretty dang advanced. In fact, let's see if a friend can help me let you look down the sight. So that's the dual optic, best we can do. You have the red dot on top. The bottom is a 3-power, essentially designed for 200 meters, maybe 3. reasonable expectations out of this type of gun and this caliber. So what'd you think of the West German, or rather German, dual optic?
You know, I like it. I'm gonna go down range and take it some. I mean, I wasn't shooting off a bench or anything, but it's real easy to pick up. You know, switching from one to the other, pretty simple. Optics, the red dot's real clear in it. That's super easy to pick up because if you're looking anywhere through it, you're gonna see it.
So our bottom optic, the 3 power, is meant for about 200 meters, although technically it can go all the way out to 6 or even 800 meters. A little optimistic there. And our reflex sight is meant for 50 to 100 meters. We have this sliding compartment on top to let more light in. We have a illuminator adjuster here. The battery can kick on automatically in low light, but you can manually plunk it up if you need to. And finally, the carry handle itself can mount the NSA 80 night vision, 3rd generation, made by Hensoldt, who's actually owned by Zeiss at this time, going on here. And of course, this whole handle is modular, bolted on with screws, because that's part of the design. It's what they wanted, and that's what they got. Trigger packs could be adjustable. You could put some automatic only, 3 or 2 round burst, full auto, you know, whatever you need to do, you can do there. Now, the magazine situation is interesting. You have an AK-style paddle mag release, also Swiss, like Sturmgewehr 90 style. And it's an effective way, simple way to have an ambi release, if you don't mind rock and lock type. Taking the mag out, yeah, it's mostly a rock and lock. And it's not Stanag. And that does seem a little odd. Here's a single cell pouch that holds one of the standard mags. They also have a 2-cell version. I just don't have them with me. Very German style. And of course it does have coupling studs on the side. This mag is very much inspired by the Swiss mag, but also the AK mag. Keep in mind, East Germany integrating in. This is a lightweight mag, a durable mag. It does have a last round hold open built in, unlike an AK type mag. There is a manual hold open catch in the trigger guard. And to be fair, since HK was hoping to market this to other countries, the magwell itself is modular with a push pin, and they did make a Stanag magwell. So it wasn't like this was only limited. It was pretty easy to switch it over to take Stanag mags. Same thing goes with optics. The export version had a 1.5 magnified optic below, so very much like the Steyr AUG, and then simple iron sights on top. Keep in mind this is before 1913. Picatinny was a thing. And of course the handguard itself was modular, held on with a single pin. There's our lightweight barrel. Notice this hole in the gas block here. That's actually for an underbarrel grenade launcher. In addition, it has a ring here for standard NATO grenades. It has the tine system that HK used since the G3, which to my mind is actually even a throwback to the QD flash hider of the G1, if you think about it. And this gas piston system is often attributed to the AR-18. That's not, untrue, but it wasn't. Even the buttstock is modular. Obviously, it just held in with one pin. This is the conventional style. There's also a C style that's about ½ inch shorter. That's usually combined with the G36K, which has a carbine-linked gas system and a 12.5 inch, give or take, barrel. The Bundesweek also purchased some of the G36K models. There's also, of course, the G36C, the submachine gun-sized model. Not many of those went into Bundeswehr service, but they ended up very popular with special forces around the world and police. And the barrel itself, if you have the right tools, and that's the thing, if you do, it's easy to exchange barrels. They're not QD or anything like that. Very long, skinny ejection port. That was done to still let cartridges get flung out, but also try to limit the ingress of dirt. Brass deflector. And you'd think there's no forward assist, but there is. You simply press in your handle, and now you're locked to your bolt group. And even though this does reciprocate with the bolt, since it goes forward and flush, you really don't notice it. It's not a handle flying around. There's no bolt release, but typically in a lot of European guns, you just pop your mag out and then, you know, just let your bolt go forward. Although some later style versions did modify this catch to kind of turn it effectively into a bolt release, I will say. It is a very modular gun. And another thing, kind of notion for East Germany, the original Bundeswehr G36 didn't actually have this bayonet lug. This is more of the modern style, or the G36E export style. It takes pretty much a Stanag bayonet like this. Actually, a US M7 or M9 won't quite fit, but the European standard, like the Acorn, or in this case a knockoff Acorn, hello Peanut, will fit. But yeah, the original ones actually have an AK style lug back here, but an AK bayonet won't just drop on because the muzzle ring, the 22 mil ring, is too big. So what they had to do, they took East German bayonets and they cut the ring off and welded on an expanded ring to work with it. So it can't just take standard AK bayonets out of the box. They have to be modified. And I don't actually have one of those. And the sling is just an HK double hook, as you see here. Simple, lightweight, effective. And that's what they went for. And I will say, at this time in the 1990s, with the scaling back of the Bundeswehr, that's what they're thinking of. Just something to defend Germany, to keep their armed forces up to date. Maybe go on some NATO operations, UN peacekeeping. That does seem to be the new name of the game, is peacekeeping in the 1990s. And for a European environment, this is fine. But 2001, the U.S. is attacked. Its allies in NATO respond, supporting it, and then the war in Afghanistan kicks off, and German troops deploy these over there. And so we see even more wide-ranging combat use of the G36 by 2002 and onward. All right, let's try it. Fold it up. Kind of notice how the ejection port is visible. And even held open. It was a thoughtful gun, and it was definitely a step forward from the G3. In the beginning, of course, frontline units got the G36, with older units having the G3. But the German government would continue to place orders for rifles, ultimately acquiring 176,000. Now that might sound small compared to the 300,000 G11s they planned on, or the 700,000 G3s. But keep in mind, as I said, they're scaling back. In fact, it seems like at their smallest number, around 2014, 2015, the Bundeswehr was under 180,000 soldiers. So it was enough for them that actually needed a gun. Of course, things would change, but that's a topic for the next video. It did well, frankly. And it was a good export thing. Famously, Spain used the G36E and adopted it to replace their Setme L. Saudi Arabia would also get licensed to produce and adopt it. Nearly 36 nations adopted the G36 in some capacity, not to mention police agencies special forces around the world. And of course, there was even the XM8 that the U.S. looked at seriously around 2002 to 2004. But again, just like with the G11, it didn't go anywhere. But compared to what happened with the G11, the G36 was a huge success for Heckler and Koch. At least it brought them back. Again, this wasn't meant to be a revolution forward like the G11. This was just an evolutionary British aerospace, which became BAE Systems around 1999, owned by Royal Ordnance, the HK company. But the G36, not to mention MP5 and later UMP and even MP7 later sales, would be successful enough for Heckler & Koch that in 2002, the company was actually sold off back to German ownership. The Bundeswehr did test the so-called heavy barrel version, but they really discovered, since HK kept it light enough to still meet their weight requirements, it didn't really matter. Instead, having two different guns, just take its bipod and put it on the handguard of the standard model, and boom, tell your guy to put it on automatic, and there is your support weapon. The U.S. did something similar in Vietnam with the M16A1. Yep. Let's try on the bipod here. Held open, obviously no release, so you just have to... Was this an ideal support weapon, light machine gun? No, but neither was the M16A1. It was just an economical choice. And again, to be fair, the MG36, the barrel is only a little bit heavier under here. They made the right choice given those constraints. But yeah, this has been in Bundeswehr service since 1997. And at least for the first 15 years, without much controversy. But around 2010, 2012, well, you know. But that's a topic for our next video. But no, I really do like the G36. I couldn't exactly tell you why, but it's not a bad gun. It's very reliable. Considering how light it is, the recoil impulse is very low. The short stroke system, very effective. The rotating bolt, conventional, but it works very well. And the charging handle, this was the original Germanic fidget spinner. And of course the HK hammer forged barrel, I mean, Teutonic quality there. I might as well come back to her. Hope you enjoyed part 2 here. The G3 is such a classic, but I think the G36 is going to age well. I think they're really neat. Like I said in the video, not perfect, but really neat. And it is one of the final Cold War era leading into post-war assault rifles. And they're a lot of fun. If you've never shot an SL8 or a G36, if you get a chance, do so. Anywho, longer version of this video was posted earlier on Patreon, so if you'd like to see that and just kind of participate, same questions, I try to answer them the same day, go over and sign up. But if you can't, we understand. Liking, sharing, subscribing, that's all great too. With that, Peanut and I will see you very soon next time.